Did everybody get 2 handouts over here? If you didn't, just raise your hand and David will bring them to you. Right, a couple right here, David. Okay, so it's a new quarter, which means new class, which means you get me for a little bit and Jacob. So a bit of the good, bit of the bad. We're going to start studying 1 Samuel this quarter. Let's go ahead and say a prayer before we start the class. Father God, we approach your throne this morning, and we're grateful to you for your word, especially for the words of life that you give to us. As we start our study on this book of 1 Samuel, help us to see Jesus in it. Help us to not just think about these stories, but think about how they fit all together into this beautiful redemption story. Help us to have open hearts to change, open minds to see what you want us to see, and open Bibles as we study this together. It's in Jesus' good name we pray. Amen. Okay, so got the handouts. Let's go ahead and start and talk about a couple, couple class expectations and objectives up here. So we're going to move pretty quick. This I wanted to do for Samuel for a long time, and me and Jacob talked about it, and this is our big hesitation right here, is we're going to be moving really fast. 31 chapters in 12 weeks because we have a gospel meeting in there as well. So we're going to have to move pretty quickly. What I think that's going to help with is that I think a lot of us know these stories really well. If I asked everybody in here to tell me the story of David and Goliath, I think you could probably tell me that story pretty easily. But how does David and Goliath fit in the book of 1 Samuel? Maybe that's a little bit harder. So we're going to look at this more from a broad range view. Since we're going to be crunched for time, that means, as we all probably should be doing for every class, and maybe I know I neglect to do often, try to read the section that we send out before class, because then we're going to be able to discuss these things a little bit more in depth. We're not going to be able to read the whole section during the class. As we read it outside of class and we talk about it together, a couple things to focus on. One is going to be, just as we already discussed, that big picture aspect of 1 Samuel. Not just, hey, how does this one story that we just read apply to me? Obviously, we're going to talk about that too, but try to focus more on, hey, as a whole in 1 Samuel, how does this fit into that puzzle piece? Okay? And then also think about stories that you're not as familiar with. So, for instance, David and Goliath, we probably won't spend a whole lot of time on, because we all have known David and Goliath from our childhood probably. But there are a lot of stories that we might not be near as familiar with, like the ark getting stolen by the Philistines, or Jonathan's kind of David and Goliath moment where he goes and fights the entire army of the Philistines. So we're going to look at those maybe a little bit more in depth. And then lastly, we're going to try something that may fail miserably, but we're going to at least try it. Memory verses. So we're going to talk about this more at the end, but what we're going to try to do is, like, how many of you can name like any verses in 1 Samuel? Maybe a couple, like, God doesn't see as man sees, God sees on the heart, and even that is not the right way to say it, right? So we're going to go through maybe every week. We're not totally sure on this yet, but we'll have one at least today. And we're going to bring in gold stickers for anybody that gets it right. No, probably what we'll do is we'll just have that slide up at the beginning of next class. And if you can say it, then close your eyes and say it with me. Or if you can't, then you're shunned out of this class. Okay. Any questions or comments on class expectations there? So do your best to read them outside of class. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the background of 1 Samuel. We've got 3 main characters in it. So tell me who's the first big main character in the book? Samuel, right? Okay, so chapters 1 through 8 are predominantly his story, and the story of how he judges Israel. And there's this huge time gap where we're not really told a lot of details. We're told a lot about when he was a child, and we're told a lot about when he is an old man. Now, he doesn't die in chapter 8, but he kind of fades away from the story slowly, starting in chapter 9. Who's this next one? Well, I already clicked it. Saul, right? King Saul is the next one. He gets a big chunk right there in the middle. And then who's the third main character? David, yeah. So if you want a really simple outline of this book, you got it right there. You got the three main characters. We're going to focus on Samuel, and then focus on Saul, and then focus on King David. They're going to be the focus of the study, but this book is not just a giant character study where we're going to focus on these three guys. There's a lot of other moving pieces, a lot of other themes that God wants us to see in this book. Okay? What about when these events occurred? Somebody give me a ballpark year, nice round number. Yeah, great. So 1,000 years BC, maybe Samuel would be like 1100-ish, somewhere in there. And also right after the period of the Judges, right? Why is that significant?
Well, the Judges were very bleak and kind of hopeless time. So Samuel's kind of like, oh, there's this little beacon of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. My dad calls the period of the Judges the armpit of Israel's history. And I kind of like that because, right, it's a horrible, horrible time for them. Sure.
Yeah. Also, at the time, I always picture this as the time when they wanted the king other than God. This is the book where that starts. When they come to, Israel comes to Samuel basically and says, we want a king like the other nations. For the first time, instead of God being the king, Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. And even in Judges, God isn't really the king, right? What do they say in Judges? What's the phrase that's repeated over and over again? Yeah, no king in Israel. Is there a king? Well, I guess God's not really the king because the people have completely rejected him. Okay, so then I've got this handy-dandy, maybe we'll see it, maybe not, but right there in the middle where it's highlighted, we're talking about 1,000 years before Christ. Tell me why that's significant, 1,000 years before Christ. That's good to know, just to know, right? But why does that matter, the scope of this book?
It's a long time between talking about David and how this descendant is going to save the world.
Yeah, so you're even talking about 2 Samuel here, or 2 Samuel 7, this promise that, hey, David, you don't get to build me a house, but I'm going to build you a house. Huge, that's huge. But even in 1 Samuel, there are so many shadows of Christ in there, so many things where it's like, hey, that story, even what we're going to talk about this morning, that story sounds eerily similar to Jesus. Hannah, that whole story sounds very similar to Jesus. So what does that mean about it? Well, this is 1,000 years before Christ, so we might consider that kind of prophecy of Jesus, even then. Okay? A couple more things with background. I thought this was really interesting. Some differences from this book compared to the Hebrew Bible. Okay? Immediately after the book of Judges, so we kind of already talked about, we know that in the time frame, but in our Bible, we've got this little nice cushion of Ruth between them where it's like, oh, this glimmer of hope in Ruth. Yeah, and in the Hebrew Bible, it's like bad, 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 bad. Okay, now Samuel comes into play, and that's the glimmer of hope that kind of Josh was talking about. Okay? The entire scroll of Samuel in the Hebrew Bible is one book. So it's not 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, it's the book of Samuel. So if we were to really do this right, it would be, like 55 chapters in 12 weeks, but we're not going to do that. That would be insane. But what that does mean is maybe we should really call this Samuel Part 1 instead of 1 Samuel. Like, don't treat this just as one book that is meant to be read on its own. If we were to really do this right, it would be 1 and 2 Samuel all together. Okay? Because once we get to the very end of 1 Samuel, what's the thing that happens at the very end? Saul dies, and then what happens at the very beginning of 2 Samuel? David becomes king, right? So this thing we've been waiting for in 1 Samuel, what chapter does David get anointed in? Does anybody remember? 16, chapter 16. So we've got 31 minus 15 chapters where David is anointed as king, and he's just waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. So we don't really get that fulfillment in 1 Samuel. So maybe whoever is teaching fourth quarter, there's your plug. If you haven't decided what you're doing, Samuel Part 2 maybe. Okay. Another thing I thought was kind of interesting with this, how would you classify the book of Samuel? And what I mean by that is like, is it a history book? Is it a wisdom book? Is it a law book? What kind of book is it? You guys speak up, be louder. History book, okay. In the Hebrew Bible, how is it classified? Does anybody know? Prophecy. Okay. So what's significant about that? Is it a history book or is it a prophecy book?
Changes the way you read it.
Yeah, talk about that more. Changes the way you read it.
Oh, just, if you're reading it purely from a historical perspective, it's more just sort of informative, not as much forward thinking as a prophecy book. You're not looking for those connections as much.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've probably all read 1 Samuel as a history book before, where it's like kind of just a neat story of like, hey, cool, like this was a really neat story that happened to Hannah. Oh, the Ark of the Covenant, guys, Israelites don't treat God like that. And then all the way through, we've got, the bad King Saul, good King David, and then we get to the end of the book, and that's that. Good to know these facts, but is that what God is really trying to teach us here? Or is there something deeper than that? I think obviously there's something deeper than that. And what we kind of already talked about is if we view this book as a prophecy book, that means who are we looking for the whole time? Jesus the whole time. And if we're looking for him, good night, we're going to find him in this book, in every story just about. Okay? Any other questions or comments on that? All right, let's keep moving then. Oh, we talked about that. Okay, so I hope you were able to read 1st and 2nd Samuel. If you weren't, not 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. If you weren't, that's okay. Thankfully, Jacob had a stellar sermon about a month ago where we talked about the story of Hannah, so we don't have to go over it too much in detail, and this is a well-known story anyway. But let's look at a couple things just here in the first couple verses of 1 Samuel chapter 1. So we're introduced to this guy named Elkanah, who is a Levite in the hill country of Ephraim. Okay? And Elkanah has 2 wives, and what are his wives' names? Hannah and Peninnah. Yeah, that's right. Okay? Right there at the beginning, though, a Levite in the hill country of Ephraim. Major bonus points. Anybody, does that ring a bell for anybody? In the book of Judges. Turn real quick to Judges chapter 19. Judges chapter 19. Does somebody want to read verse 1? Judges chapter 19.
There was no king in Israel. A certain Levite sojourning in the Roman parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judea.
Okay, thanks, Josh. So we've got a Levite who's sojourning in the hill country of Ephraim. Does anybody remember that story, how it ends? Kind of dominates the rest of Judges. This is like Sodom and Gomorrah 2.0, right? Where the Levite, he has this wife who leaves him. He goes and gets her back. They stay in this town called Gibeah in the tribe of Benjamin. Remember that? And knocking at the door, just like at Sodom and Gomorrah. And the wife, I should have read this story more. The father, now I can't remember. The person he's staying with, his daughter, they are left out to the mob, essentially, that's knocking at the door wanting this man. And okay, the concubine is, I'm apologize for not reading this better. The concubine that he's upset with is pushed out of the house, and if you remember, it's just essentially Sodom 2.0. And then what happens after that? Remember? He chops up the limbs of the concubine, sends them to all the tribes of Israel, and then what happens? Civil war, right? Which tribe gets almost all the way wiped out? Benjamin. So Benjamin is almost completely toast by the end of the book. Okay? So now we have in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1, another Levite who's in the hill country of Ephraim. So that kind of alarm bell is going off like, uh-oh, what's story 2.0 here? Well, thankfully, this is a story of redemption. This is a story of hope. This is a story of the remnant that's still in Israel. Okay. And then verses 2 through 8 talk all about this woman named Hannah, who's one of his wives. What's significant about Hannah compared to Peninnah? Yeah, so Peninnah, the one wife, has a lot of children, and Hannah has no children. She's barren. This is kind of hard to think about in our day and age, but this was especially hard in Hannah's time, right? Childbirth was a major component of a woman's role, and when the wife was barren, she failed in that role. No fault of her own, but she did. This affected her future security and prosperity, right? She doesn't have a 401k or life insurance plan on her husband. Her children are that for her, right? And you can clearly see in this text that it's affecting her self-worth, right? She's not eating. Her husband tries to comfort her, like, am I not better than 10 sons to you? And she doesn't react to that in the slightest. Okay?
It's even worse the fact that the other wife was egging her on or harassing her because of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Peninnah is kind of digging the knife in even further by ridiculing her. Every year they go up to worship, Peninnah's like, hey, like, it's great to worship God, but isn't he the one that's withholding this child from you? And I have all these all these children. Okay, great. Where have we seen that story before?
Sarah and Hagar.
Okay, so Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, Rebecca, Rachel and Leah. Where else have we seen barrenness before? Samson's parents, right? Manoah and his wife. Say it again, Wayne.
Wasn't it John's mother?
Oh, yeah, after that, certainly. But 4 cases of barrenness before this story. So let's say we've never read 1 Samuel before and we don't know what's going to happen here. What's going to happen here? What do we already know about God?
Reversal.
Say it again.
Reversal.
Yeah, reversal, what we're going to see in chapter 2. God takes what is barren and he brings it to life. So if there's nothing else we're going to learn today, I hope there's more we'll learn today, but that is the God that we serve, is the God who takes anything that's barren and brings it to life. So anytime you see that in Scripture, if you were reading this with completely fresh eyes, we would not be surprised when we see a barren woman. God's already set up that theme. A barren woman means, oh, that woman's probably going to get pregnant and have a baby because God's going to intervene.
And not just barren in old age to the where it's unnatural.
Yeah, we don't know if Hannah was old or not, how old she was, but certainly that's true with Abraham and Sarah. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, so she's upset. She's completely, she won't eat. She's at the point where worshiping God every year going up to Shiloh is not really, it's miserable for her because all she's thinking about is what she can't have. Okay? So then verses 9 through 18, we kind of see Hannah's first prayer. So somebody sum up Hannah's first prayer for me. What does she say to God as she comes to Shiloh?
She swears an oath to the Lord if he will give her a son.
Yeah, so if you'll give me a son, then I will give him back to you. Yeah. Okay, so Jacob talked a lot about this idea of like there's a certain price already paid for the firstborn, and there's also this Nazirite vow here that's kind of hinted at, right? That no razor shall ever touch his head. But she kind of goes a step further here and is not just sacrificing the things required for the firstborn to redeem them back to her. She's saying like, if you give him to me, I'll give him back to you. What's significant about that? What is Hannah's retirement plan? Her son. So what is she essentially saying here? I give it up. All the reasons I've been wanting this son, the humiliation, the security, all of it, I'm giving it up. If you just let me have this son, I'll give him right back to you. So many lessons for us there. We really don't have a whole lot of time to think about, but what about in your life where, what's that one thing you've been asking God for that's maybe for me, instead of asking for it in order to give it back to him? Yes, sir.
I remember in one of Gary's lessons, he talked about Israel wailing like the loss of a firstborn son. And it's really a big deal to give that child up. Just huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more here when she gives birth to Samuel. Okay, what other thoughts do you have on that? Who comes up? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Just on the thought that you just said, you can see the trust and the faith that she has in God, and how He rewards her for that later on.
Yeah.
She's thinking she's giving up her own son, and that's all she's going to have.
Absolutely.
And He continues to bless her constantly.
Absolutely. So that trust and faith, where is that really seen? So we see Eli come up, and what does he think about Hannah? She's drunk. So that says a lot about the society of the time, and it says a lot about Eli. Eli's not going to be painted in a very good light after this either. But he thinks she's drunk, and he's like, get up, stop drinking, go your way. And she's like, no, I'm not drinking. I'm talking to God from the heart. So another quick lesson for us: can we pray without talking? 1,000% yes, and God hears those prayers. But he sees her and he's like, okay, your wish is granted, essentially. It's kind of the language he uses of, may God bless you and give you what you're asking for. What happens next? Very next verse. Verse 18. Yeah, her face is no longer sad, right? Is she pregnant? Nope. So what's the order there? She prays, she gets pregnant, and then her face is no longer sad. Nope. She prays, her face is no longer sad, and then she gets pregnant.
Call that faith.
Absolutely, they call that faith. What else on that first prayer? Okay, so after this, we kind of talked already about that a little bit. Why does God answer this prayer instead of the other thousands that Hannah's prayed? Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that all this time she's been wanting to get back at Peninnah perhaps and finally have a son of her own for her own security. Well, now she's giving that child up. And God says, all right, now you're ready.
It's in God's time. That's the problem.
Absolutely, absolutely. So then verses 19 through 28, we have the birth of Samuel. God remembers Hannah. She conceives and bears a son, Samuel. It's an emotional moment as Hannah's request is finally fulfilled and she has a son. And then when he's weaned, she fulfills her vow and takes him back to Eli, right? What does that say about Hannah compared to maybe the book of Judges that she does this? If you're reading the Bible for the first time and you're going through the book of Judges, this horrendous scene that's just happened, what do we kind of expect Hannah maybe to do?
Turn back on her vow.
Yeah, maybe renege on her promise and say like, yeah, God, I know I really promised that, but this is my kiddo and I want to keep him because I need him. Okay? Not so. So even throughout this period of Judges, this horrible period where Israel's kind of down spiraling, still a remnant. Still people that really care and want to be godly and want to fulfill their promises to God. Okay?
Footnote in the Bible that I've got that said Samuel. Samuel sounds like the Hebrew word for heard of God, which evidently it wasn't a common name. And the thing that she named him because God heard her, and this was the result. It will always call back to memory. His name calls back to memory that God used her.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What else about this story? We're going to spend a lot of time on her second prayer here in a second. What else do you notice in this story that's significant? Yeah.
saw herself as God's servant in all of this.
Yeah. Reminds you a lot of somebody else 1,000 years later, right? Who calls God, who says that she's God's servant. Mary. A lot more we could say about this. God remembering Hannah, Hannah fulfilling her vow. How old? So it says she weaned him. Typical is like a year-ish now, I think. But back then it was a lot longer of a weaning process. So we might say like 3 or 4 even. I got a 3-year-old right now. And to imagine like giving that child up, horrifying, right? Hannah does it. And what experience has she already had with Eli? Not great. This guy thinks I'm drunk. And not to step on Jacob's lesson next week, but what do we know about his sons? Terrible. Terrible, terrible. What does Hannah do? She fulfills her vow, and she trusts in God. Okay. I want to spend some time thinking about, and you should have a handout, and if you don't, David will get you one if you raise a hand, if you came in a little bit late. Voluntold, that's what we call that. You should have a handout of the first 10 verses of chapter 2. Let's see here. So what we're going to do, what is really cool about this book to me is kind of bookends. If we're talking about Samuel as a whole, the whole book of Samuel, there are 2 bookends in Samuel. The first one is this prayer right here, where Hannah kind of lays out some themes that are going to be throughout the whole book. And then also at the very end of 2 Samuel, there's this song that David sings that kind of lays out the exact same themes that we've kind of already seen. So in between those is the meat of the story and where those themes are really played out. So what I want you to do is spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes here marking this text up, and there's a back as well, verses 8 through 10 are on the back. Marking this text up and just seeing what messages you can find in this text, in this prayer that Hannah gives. And what's cool about it is pretty much every message that you can find out of it, those are themes for the whole book that we're going to study. So go ahead and take 3 or 4 minutes and just review those. Okay, go ahead and wrap up your thoughts. And let's go ahead and read it together, and then we'll dig into some of these themes and messages that y'all have come up with. Okay, chapter 2, verse 1. And Hannah prayed and said, "My heart exults in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your own mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, and she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Okay, so what messages do you see in that? Sir.
Where does our strength come from? And even the continuation from Judges, if you look at the last Nazarite from birth, it was Samson. And where does Samson feel like his strength came from? Well, it's his hair. So it's a continuation of where do we really find our strength?
Yeah, I phrased it. Okay, well, I'm going to spoil the first one here, but I phrased it. Okay, well, just look at all of them, whatever. The third one there, earthly might is not true might, is how I phrased it. Look at the end of verse 9. For not by might shall a man prevail. Is that true in the book of 1 Samuel? Where is that true? Tell me those stories. David and Goliath. Not by might shall a man prevail. What else? Jonathan and the Philistines. What else?
David and Saul.
Say it again.
David and Saul.
David and Saul, absolutely. Which one is taller, stronger? Saul absolutely is a head taller than everyone else. Not by might shall a man prevail.
But Saul was king, and he was a nobody.
Yeah, definitely in the beginning. We're going to talk about how he had some good moments there at the beginning, but it's kind of fell apart.
You know, a form of the word exalt, it comes up 4 times. Exaltation, exalt, and we don't use that term very much anymore. What does exalt really mean? It's just, we don't use that term.
Yeah, I think a great way to say it is just lift up. Lift them up. Okay, aside from the ones that I have on the board, what did you see in your own words? And everyone's looking up there now.
Just a few connection points for me. You had mentioned 4 different times we've seen barrenness. And so when we read that, we already know what's coming. And what I was thinking of comparing this to is exactly what you said. You should have some expectations, but 2, when you read that, there's going to be some major significance to the birth and also the holy life of that person being born.
Absolutely.
Because what we see in Samuel's birth is kind of a transition, and the man who is going to be wearing several different hats at once. He's going to be a priest, he's going to be a prophet, he's going to be a judge, precursor to 1,000 years later. But verse 10, the king is coming. What we see in these prayers is you've already shown her faithfulness and her trust in the Lord. She starts her prayer the exact same way Mary starts her prayer.
Yeah, pump the brakes on that one, but yes, absolutely. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But if you go read Luke chapter 1, this is like almost a shot-for-shot remake of this prayer. So yes, that's great. Okay, but the king is coming. That's a significant one. Who's the king that Hannah is talking about? Why is that weird that she talks about a king? Who's the king right now? There is no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Okay? No king right now. So what king is she talking about? Okay. Saul? She's talking about Saul? And David? Huh?
I think she's talking about God.
Yeah, I do too. You notice I put king in capital K there. So, yes, in one sense, Saul and David are coming, but the anointed, anytime we read about the anointed and the king, he will give strength to his king, this is absolutely a foreshadowing of Christ coming. So that's going to be a major theme in this book. There's going to be little hints every now and then throughout all these stories. Are like, hey, that story sounds like Jesus, something Jesus did. Go chase that. Go see how Jesus probably perfected that story. Hannah, like what Brian was already saying, Hannah's story is awesome. Barren woman. Okay, take it up a notch with Mary and a virgin birth. Like even crazier than that. Okay? What other themes?
I like that verse 1 just talks about her God being the salvation. It's over and over. It's all about God.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's the main character of every book, right? He's certainly the one, like, we can't divulge into just a character study of how was Saul right and wrong, how was David right and wrong. It's really ultimately God's the main character. Yes, ma'am.
The end of verse 2, there's no rock like our God. We see in Samuel like some arcs of people trusting in God and doing really well, and then they trust in themselves and then they do really poorly. For example, Hannah was trying to get a son, and then when she decides I'm going to trust in God, she gets a son. Then Saul trusted God at the beginning of his kingship and does really well, and then he decides to trust himself and goes down. Same thing with David.
Yeah.
It's like, where are you putting your
Absolutely. And that kind of hints at that first one up there, right? God humbles the proud and exalts the humble. We're going to see that throughout this whole book. Who's the humble king? David. Who's the proud king? Saul. Okay? We're going to see a huge contrast between the two of them and how they react to a lot of different circumstances. But it's not just that story. Who's the proud one in David and Goliath? Goliath, right? And David's the humble one saying, not by my might, but God will help me in this. So, yes, ma'am.
I was thinking that kind of to the first point up there, if you look at this prayer and look at just the verbs that are associated with God, raises, seeds, guards, gives, I think that in a book like this, is just like narrative and history, and a lot of that, if you went through and highlighted all of the verbs throughout the book, just seeing how active God is in this type of text, it's pretty overwhelming, and it shows him as being so active and present and just doing so many things, and it's highlighted a lot of this type of story.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to read this and focus on the men instead of focusing on the one who's really controlling everything and maybe even taking a back seat to these men. And yeah, absolutely. Sir.
This comparison, I think, of the first verse and the last verse that you have he said, "My horn is exalted, Lord," in the last line on the page is talking about the Lord. It goes it's all the horn in this one. I just find it interesting that he uses that word horn, being exalted in both cases, not only for yourself, but for the one who will be anointed.
It's kingdom talk, right? Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a look. We're running out of time here. Let's take a look at this other one I have up here as well. Judgment will come against God's enemies. You see there in verses 9 and 10. Who's the main bad guy in 1 Samuel? Not King Saul necessarily. Who's the main nation bad guy in 1 Samuel? Philistines, right? Philistines are the main nation that's going to be just a thorn in their side all book. We're going to see a lot of times where they get wiped out, where they, with Goliath, with Samuel, with Saul, with Jonathan, all of them are constantly fighting the Philistines, and God is judging his enemies. Now, who else is an enemy in the book? Eli's sons, King Saul at certain points. These men that are proud people, they kind of get what's coming to them. Okay, so those are the four main ones we're going to look at throughout this story, especially that first one, I would say, especially in the difference between King David and King Saul, how they react in every situation. God's kind of asking, whose heart do you have? You have David's heart, where when you do something wrong, you admit it and you move on and ask for forgiveness, or you have Saul's heart, where you justify everything you do just for your own sake and for your own ego. Okay, so seeing Jesus in the text, let's look at this as we wrap up here. Hannah and Mary, absolutely. If you compare this section right here with Luke chapter 1, it is like a shot-for-shot remake. Hannah talks about the humble being exalted and the proud being brought down in exactly the same way Mary does too. Certainly Samuel and Jesus, right? Miracle birth happens, God intervenes there, and then they are certainly given to the Lord. Mary is God's servant, and she completely gives Jesus back to God. Okay? Memory verse time. What we're going to do here, so 1 Samuel 2, chapter 2, verse 2, what we're going to do is we're going to say it together, which might be a little weird, but I don't really care. So let's say it together, and then throughout this week, try to think about that and try to remember it, okay? So ready? There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. How true is that in this book? David, when he's being chased everywhere by Saul, what does he cling to? Well, we're going to see in the Psalms class over and over again, David talks about God being his rock, his salvation throughout all of this. Okay, next week, we'll try to be faithful in sending out reminders to you on the text that we're going to study, but the second half of 1 Samuel chapter 2 through chapter 4. Thank you all very much.